The morning I found out my daughter-in-law had rerouted my mail was a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had just come back from my water aerobics class at the Y, the one I'd been going to every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 11 years. My hair was still damp when I pulled into the driveway and noticed the mailbox flag was up, which was strange because I hadn't put it up. I hadn't sent anything. I opened it anyway. Empty. I stood there in my driveway in my wet swimsuit under a cardigan, holding open an empty mailbox, and something in my chest went very still. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 63 years old. I live in the same house in Terre Haute, Indiana, that my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1987 for $84,000 when the neighborhood still had working street lights and a hardware store on the corner. I planted the hydrangeas along the front walk myself, 2 at a time every other spring. They're the kind that change color depending on the soil acidity, and over the years they've drifted from pink to a deep stormy blue that I've come to love better than the original. I taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary for 31 years. Not because the salary was remarkable, it wasn't, but because I believed in it. Gerald drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor. We were not wealthy people. What we had, we built slowly, carefully, the way people do when they can't afford to make many mistakes. Gerald died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't have time to say half of what we meant to say, and I've been carrying the unfinished sentences ever since. Our son Ryan was 41 when his father passed. He flew in from Atlanta the night we got the diagnosis, stayed for the funeral, and was back on a plane 3 days later. He said he couldn't miss any more work. I told him I understood. I meant it then. That Tuesday morning with the empty mailbox, I went inside and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. It was the same table where Ryan used to sit doing homework with his sneakers, unlaced, talking to me about whatever movie he and his friends wanted to see that weekend. The same table where Gerald and I ate every breakfast for 30 years. The ceramic rooster salt shaker was still in the middle where it always sat. I looked at it for a long time. Then I called the post office. It took me 3 calls and a trip to the actual building on Ohio Street before anyone confirmed what I suspected. A mail forwarding request had been filed 6 weeks prior. All correspondence addressed to Dorothy Callahan at my address was being rerouted to an address in Alpharetta, Georgia, Ryan's address. I drove home and sat in the car in my own driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. It wasn't exactly anger, not yet. It was more like standing at the edge of something you thought was solid ground and feeling it shift just slightly underfoot. That small, horrible warning before the fall. I want to tell you the whole of it because the mail was only where it started. Gerald and I had spent the last decade doing what responsible people do when they start thinking about the end of things. We updated our wills. We met with a financial planner. We converted the house into a revocable living trust so probate wouldn't be a drawn-out nightmare for whoever came after us. The house was worth a good deal more than what we paid. The neighborhood had come back in the way some neighborhoods do, and Gerald had a life insurance policy, and I had my teacher's pension and a modest 403B that I'd contributed to every single year since 1989 without touching once. We were not rich, but we had built something. When Gerald died, I sat down with our attorney, a woman named Carol Biggs, who has an office above the dry cleaner on Wabash Avenue and has been practicing estate law in this county for 25 years. We went through everything. I was the surviving trustee. The assets were mine to manage, and eventually to distribute however I chose. Carol explained my rights to me calmly and without condescension, which I've always appreciated about her. About a year after Gerald's funeral, Ryan came to visit. It was the first real visit, not just a holiday stop. He stayed for a long weekend, and we sat on the back porch and talked more than we had in years. He told me about a commercial real estate investment opportunity he was involved in. He was careful with the language, the way he always is, the way he learned from years of working in finance. He didn't say he needed my help. He said he wanted me to be part of something he was building. I asked questions. He had answers for most of them. He left on Sunday evening and hugged me at the door and said it was good to talk. 3 weeks later, I signed papers at a notary near my house, co-signing a promissory note for a business loan. $200,000. I thought I was investing in my son's future. I thought that was what a mother did. His wife, Melissa, had never quite warmed to me. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I've made my peace with it. But it was the kind of truth you spend a few years trying to argue yourself out of before you just accept it. When Ryan and Melissa got married 9 years ago in a ceremony in Savannah, I sat where I was put. I smiled in the photos I was included in. I bought a dress in the color Melissa's mother suggested. I brought a gift from the registry and a card with a handwritten note that took me 4 drafts to get right. At the rehearsal dinner, Melissa's mother gave a 15-minute toast. I was not asked to speak. I told myself families take time to form. I kept sending birthday cards. I sent their daughter, my granddaughter Penelope, a quilt I made myself for her first birthday, the kind my own grandmother used to make, with squares cut from fabric I'd been saving for years. Melissa posted a photo of Penelope in front of it on Instagram and thanked, quote, a family friend, unquote. I didn't say anything. I kept sending cards. The summer before the mail forwarding, Ryan called to ask if I could co-sign an extension on the original loan. There had been delays, he said. A zoning issue with the county. Nothing serious, just paperwork, but the financing gap needed to be bridged. I asked him to send me the documents first. He said there wasn't time. I said I needed to see them before I signed anything. The call ended cordially enough, but he didn't send the documents and I didn't sign. After that, the calls slowed. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that stopped, not immediately, but eventually, once the silence has settled. He used to call on Sundays. Then it was every other Sunday. Then it was when he needed something, and when there was nothing he needed, the phone was quiet. I found out about the reunion through my niece Patrice, who lives in Columbus and who I speak to more regularly than my own son. She called me on a Thursday evening to say she was looking forward to seeing me at the Callahan family gathering in July, and did I know if Ryan and Melissa were driving or flying in. I didn't know what gathering she was talking about. Patrice got very quiet. Then she said, "Oh, Dot, I'm sure you got the email." I had not gotten any email. I had not gotten any invitation. What I had gotten in the past 6 weeks, as it turned out, was nothing, because everything addressed to me had been quietly rerouted to my son's house in Alpharetta, Georgia, where presumably Melissa had been deciding what I needed to know. I thanked Patrice and got off the phone. I sat at the kitchen table again with the ceramic rooster between my hands and thought about the quilt and the rehearsal dinner and the Sunday calls that stopped and the loan documents that were never sent. And I thought about Gerald, who died in 6 weeks and never got to see how this part turned out. Then I picked up my phone and sent Ryan a text message. Just 3 words. Did I qualify? A reference to something he'd said once, years ago, about how Melissa's family had a certain set of standards for who made the cut at their gatherings. He'd said it as a joke. I hadn't laughed then either. He didn't respond for 2 days. When he did, it was a phone call, not a text back, and his voice had that careful, measured tone that I recognized from the loan conversations. He said the gathering had been kept small this year. He said it was nothing personal. He said Melissa's family had taken the lead on planning and the guest list had been finalized before he'd had a chance to weigh in. I asked him directly, "Was I on the list at any point?" He paused. "Mom, let's not do this." I said, "I'm not doing anything. I'm asking a question." He said he'd call me later in the week. He did not call me later in the week. I am not a woman who has ever needed a great deal of drama to move through. I was raised by a woman who survived losing her first home in a flood and her first husband to Korea, and who rebuilt twice without what I would call visible grief. I understood from a very young age that the dignified response to being hurt was usually silence and action in that order. So I didn't call Ryan back. I called Carol Biggs. I sat in Carol's office on a Wednesday morning with the same file folder I'd brought in when Gerald died. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always trusted about her. When I finished, she asked me a few questions. Then she leaned back in her chair and asked me what I wanted to do. I told her. She nodded. She didn't look surprised. The trust was straightforward in terms of my rights. I was the trustee. I had full authority to modify the distribution of assets at any time during my lifetime. There was nothing Ryan could legally contest while I was alive and competent, which I very much was. Carol walked me through the steps with the same patience she'd shown me 4 years ago across a very different table. The primary beneficiary change took about 40 minutes to execute. I didn't remove Ryan from everything. I want to be clear about that, because the story could be told in a way that makes it sound like pure retaliation. And that's not what it was, or at least not all of what it was. I reduced his shares significantly. I left him something because he is still my son, and because Gerald loved him, and because there is a version of Ryan that I raised who used to fall asleep on the couch with his baseball glove still on his hand, waiting for the late game to end. What I redirected went to 3 places. The first was Penelope's college fund. Not through Ryan and Melissa, I set it up independently. A 529 account with my name as custodian, with instructions that it transfers directly to Penelope when she turns 18 for education expenses only. Whatever else happens in this family, my granddaughter will have something from me that no one can intercept. The second was my sister-in-law Frances, Gerald's younger sister, who is 71 and has been quietly managing on a fixed income since her husband passed 8 years ago. She never asked me for anything. When Gerald was in the hospital, Frances drove 4 hours each way 3 times to sit with me in the waiting room. She brought me sandwiches from the place Gerald liked, and she never once told me it would be okay, because she knew that might not be true. I have loved her for that ever since. The third was Lincoln Elementary. I know that might sound strange, but I taught there for 31 years. I know which classrooms face west and get unbearable in the afternoon heat. I know that the 3rd grade reading library hasn't been updated since 2011. I know that there are children who come to school in January without adequate coats because no one in their house is managing things well enough to notice, and that there are teachers buying school supplies out of their own paychecks every August. I established a small fund through the school's foundation specifically for classroom supplies and cold weather gear for students in need. It's not enormous, but it's real. Carol sent Ryan formal notification as required by law. Within 18 hours, I had 11 missed calls. The first few were Ryan, then Melissa, then a number I didn't recognize that turned out, when I finally listened to the voicemail, to be a man who identified himself as a financial advisor working with Ryan, who explained in a very measured tone that the trust modification could have significant implications for certain financial instruments currently in place and requested a call back at my earliest convenience. I did not call back at my earliest convenience. I went to my water aerobics class on Thursday morning instead. The water was warm and the instructor, a young woman named Becca, who is relentlessly cheerful in a way that I find genuinely comforting, led us through the full 45 minutes and ended with a cool down she called the river float, where you just let the water hold you for a minute. I did that. I let the water hold me. When I got home, there were 7 more missed calls. I made a sandwich and sat on the back porch and watched a pair of cardinals argue over something in the bird bath. The male kept flashing that red like he thought it would settle the matter. It didn't. The female looked unimpressed. Patrice called that evening and I picked up. She'd apparently heard from someone at the Columbus branch of the family that something was happening, though the details had reached her in incomplete form. I told her the relevant parts. There was a long pause and then she said, "Good for you, Dot. I mean that. I appreciated it. I didn't need it, but I appreciated it." Carol called me on Friday morning with information that recalibrated everything. She spoke carefully, the way she does when she wants to make sure I understand the weight of what she's telling me before she says it plainly. She told me that in the process of reviewing the trust documentation in preparation for the modification paperwork, she had discovered that 6 months earlier, someone had submitted an inquiry to the trust's financial institution presenting Ryan as an authorized agent with management authority over the account. He was not an authorized agent. He had never been an authorized agent. The trust documents were explicit on this point. The inquiry had been flagged internally and not acted upon. But it had been made. Someone had tested the door. I asked Carol what the inquiry had been seeking. She told me that whoever submitted it had been asking about the process for leveraging trust assets as collateral for a secondary loan instrument. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter for a moment. Not because I couldn't continue the conversation, but because I needed a second to put the shape of it together in a way I could hold. He had been trying to borrow against my house, against Gerald's life insurance proceeds, against the 31 years of teacher pension contributions I had made, without touching, without complaint, in a job that paid me $38,000 a year for the first decade I worked it. He had been trying to use what Gerald and I built as a backstop for something he hadn't told me about, banking on the assumption that I would be too trusting, too distant, too docile to notice. The mail forwarding made more sense now. If I wasn't receiving correspondence from financial institutions, I wasn't seeing inquiries, flags, or notices. I was being kept in a pleasant fog while someone managed the situation around me. Carol said very gently, "Dorothy, you made this change at exactly the right time." I knew that. I was also sitting with the knowledge that my son had looked at the life his father and I built and seen a resource to be managed rather than a love to be honored. That's a particular kind of grief. It doesn't have a clean name. It sits somewhere between mourning and disillusionment, and it's heavy in a way that anger isn't, because anger at least has heat. I thanked Carol and told her I would be in touch. Ryan showed up on Saturday. He didn't call ahead, which I had half expected. He knocked twice, and I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the front porch in a button-down shirt with his jaw set the way it gets when he's rehearsed what he's going to say. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I was just looking more carefully. I let him in. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen. I don't know why I made that choice. Maybe I didn't want whatever was about to happen happening at the table where Gerald and I ate breakfast. He started with the trust. He said he felt blindsided. He said he'd had no warning, no conversation, no opportunity to discuss it. I let him get through the whole of it before I said anything. Then I said, "Did you submit an inquiry to my financial institution representing yourself as an authorized agent of the Callahan Living Trust?" He went still. "Did you forward my mail to your address without my permission?" He opened his mouth. "Were you planning to tell me about the secondary loan instrument before or after you'd already used my house as collateral?" He closed his mouth. The room was quiet for long enough that I could hear the cardinals outside again, that persistent arguing. When he finally spoke, he said it was more complicated than I was making it sound. He said the financial situation with the commercial property had gotten difficult in ways he hadn't anticipated, and that he'd been trying to protect me from the stress of it, and that he had never intended for any of it to touch me directly. He'd just needed a bridge, just temporarily, just until the deal closed. I said, "That was not your bridge to use." He said, "You would have helped me if I'd asked." I said, "Maybe, but you didn't ask." He said a few more things after that. He talked about legacy and about what Dad would have wanted and about Penelope and about how Melissa was not who I thought she was, which I found interesting timing for. He said he was sorry. He said it quickly, toward the end, in the way people say it when they're hoping the word will do more work than they're putting into it. I told him I heard him. I told him the Penelope Fund was real and would be there for her when she was 18 and he could not touch it. I told him that Frances would be taken care of because Gerald would have wanted that, and so did I. I told him I loved him in the way that doesn't require his good behavior to remain true, but that I was no longer willing to be a resource he managed around. He left without saying much more. I stood at the front window and watched his car pull out and thought about the 6-year-old boy who used to sit on the front steps in his pajamas waiting for Gerald's truck to turn onto our street at the end of the day. I thought about the time he got the flu so bad in 2nd grade that he slept in our bed for 3 days, and I read to him until my voice gave out. I thought about the way he looked at Gerald's funeral, that same expression from childhood, like he expected me to know what to do next. I didn't have an answer for that version of him. I still don't. I just know that loving someone and protecting yourself from someone are not always in conflict, and when they are, you have to make a choice. I made mine. The week after Ryan left, I drove to Columbus to see Patrice. We had dinner at a place she liked, a little Italian restaurant with low lighting and bread that came out warm, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. She asked me how I was really doing, and I told her the truth, which is that I was sad in the deep down way that doesn't go away quickly, but that I was also underneath that, something I could only describe as clear. Like a window after rain. She said that sounded about right. On the Tuesday after I got back, I went to Lincoln Elementary. Not to teach, I retired 3 years ago, but to meet with the principal, a man named Marcus Webb, who took over the year before I left and who I've always respected. I told him about the fund. I kept it simple. He looked at me across his desk for a moment and then said, "Mrs. Callahan, do you know how many kids we had show up last February without winter coats?" I told him I had a pretty good idea. He said, 22. We shook hands. On my way out, I walked past my old classroom. The door was open and I could hear a woman's voice reading aloud. Something with a lot of expression. The kids were quiet in that listening way they get when they're actually caught. I stood in the hallway for just a minute and listened. It's strange what holds. All those years, all that noise, and what stayed was the sound of a room of children actually paying attention. I drove home the long way, past the hardware store that's been a cell phone repair shop for 15 years now, past the Y where Becca would be setting up cones for tomorrow's class, past the house on Maple that went up for sale last spring and still hasn't moved. When I got home, the hydrangeas along the front walk were catching the late afternoon light, that stormy blue I've come to love. I stood in the driveway for a minute and just looked at them. I had a letter waiting from Ryan's attorney. Formal language legal review requested the usual architecture of someone trying to make noise without having much ground to stand on. Carol had already told me what to expect and what it would and wouldn't amount to. I brought it inside, set it on the counter, and put the kettle on. I'll deal with it. I'll deal with all of it. In the way I've dealt with most hard things. Steadily, without theater, one step at a time. Gerald used to say that the most useful thing his mother ever taught him was the difference between a problem and a condition. A problem, she said, can be solved. A condition has to be managed or accepted or outlasted. He applied it to everything: bad traffic, difficult colleagues, the slow leak in the basement we could never quite fix. I think about that distinction a lot these days. Ryan is not a problem I can solve. He's a condition I am learning to manage. The grief of it is real. The love underneath the grief is also real. Both things are true at the same time, and I've stopped trying to make one cancel out the other. What I know is this. I worked 31 years in a classroom. I put in every dollar I could into accounts I never touched. I kept every promise I made to the people who needed me. I showed up at every funeral and every graduation and every hospital room that mattered, including the one where I lost Gerald. I did not do any of that to be someone's collateral. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I believed that how you move through the world leaves a mark, and because I wanted the mark I left to be one I could live with. Penelope will go to college someday. She'll have money set aside by a grandmother she may or may not have been told much about. I hope someone tells her the story honestly. I hope she knows that it came from love, not from score settling, even if the two looked alike from the outside for a while. Frances called last week to tell me the paperwork had arrived and she'd cried reading it. I told her Gerald would have wanted this. She said she knew. We stayed on the phone for a while without saying much, which is one of the things I've always loved about Frances. She knows when silence is enough. If you've ever given everything you had to someone who turned around and treated it like a transaction, I want you to know something. Your sacrifice was real, even if they didn't honor it. Your love was real, even if they used it poorly. And your right to protect yourself, to redirect your care toward people who receive it honestly, that is real too. That is not bitterness. That is not revenge. That is just finally knowing your own worth. I still sleep on my side of the bed. I still make 2 cups of coffee in the morning out of habit before I remember. I still talk to Gerald sometimes when the house is quiet in that particular way. But I am still here, and the hydrangeas are still blue, and some mornings that is enough. I've been thinking about what Carol said to me the day we finished the paperwork. Not the legal language, I've already let most of that go, but the simple thing she said when I stood up to leave. She said, "You did the right thing, and not just emotionally." I've turned that over a lot since then, because here's what I've come to understand about how life actually works. Not in a grand or mystical sense, but in the plain, observable way you start to see clearly once you've been around long enough to watch things play out. The way you treat people accumulates. It doesn't disappear. Every time Ryan needed something, a signature, a cosign, a bridge, I was there. Every time I needed something, a phone call, an invitation, just to be included, there was silence. That accumulation on both sides was always going to land somewhere. It just took longer than it should have for me to understand that I had a say in where. What Ryan did wasn't a single bad decision. It was a pattern of small ones, each one individually deniable, each one easy to explain away, each one counting on my willingness to let it go. The mail forwarding wasn't cruelty exactly, it was calculation, and that, in some ways, is harder to sit with than cruelty would have been. Cruelty at least is honest about what it is. I don't think Ryan is a bad person. I think he made a series of choices in which my well-being consistently ranked below his own convenience, and he kept making them because I kept absorbing the cost without naming it. That's not entirely his fault. I taught him that was acceptable, not with words, but with years of quiet accommodation. We teach people how to treat us. I had been teaching the wrong lesson for a long time. That's the part that took the most honesty to sit with. Not what he did, what I allowed. Redirecting the trust wasn't revenge. I need to say that plainly, because I know how it can sound from the outside. It was a correction. It was me finally making my actions match my values, putting real weight behind what I actually believed, that care should go where it's genuinely received. That sacrifice means something and shouldn't be spent on people who've decided it's a given. Penelope will have her college fund because she is an innocent child who didn't choose any of this. Frances will have security because she showed up in a hospital waiting room with sandwiches and didn't make promises she couldn't keep. Lincoln Elementary will have coats and books because 31 years of my life went into those hallways, and the children walking them now deserve to inherit something from that. Those choices required something from that. They required me to stop waiting for Ryan to become who I hoped he was, and to start building something real with the time and resources I actually had. Resilience, I've decided, is not about being unbreakable. It's about being honest about what broke and choosing what to build next. Wisdom isn't knowing what to do before it happens. It's being willing to look clearly at what did happen, without flinching, without rewriting it to protect your own comfort and integrity. That's the quiet one, the one nobody talks about much. Integrity is just making sure that what you do matches what you know to be true, even when no one's watching, even when it costs you something. I am 63 years old. I have time left. I intend to use it well. If you've been absorbing costs you never agreed to, carrying weights that was handed to you and never taken back, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to set it down, not with anger, not with a speech, just quietly, firmly. the way you'd set down anything that had gotten too heavy to carry without hurting yourself. That is not giving up on someone. That is finally taking yourself seriously. And it is never, ever too late to start.